people, also Dr. Rubin's, both of them. And I brought them up for my bat mitzvah, and then the rabbi, upon meeting them, invited them to come give a presentation, and they graciously accepted. It's a very special opportunity. They're dear to my heart, both of them, and to share my dad's world, that I spent a lot of time in his congregation, and Temple Beth that I love, is a gift to me. As we all know, when we bring families and friends to our own temple, and they understand what it means to us. So make sure your cell phones are off, you're comfortable. We'll welcome you now.
Hello.
Testing. Is that okay? You can hear?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to introduce my mom. So thank you very much for that kind welcome.
Thank you.
Both from Rabbi Steinberg and also from Dr. Jerry Rubin, who has become an excellent friend. And thank you for all of the incredible hosting and preparations that you've made for this event. So now I'm Dr. Haya Rubin, as you were told. I'm from Mountain View, California, and I do go to temple at Congregation Beth, where Jerry has visited her dad, as she said. And I'm so glad that we have become friends and that I'm getting to know people here in this congregation as well and in this community. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my mother, Dr. Anna Halberstam Rubin. And she's going to give you a little background and context for her experiences, and then we'll read some excerpts from her recently published book, Just a Little Girl, Despair and Deliverance, which we brought along some copies of in case you are interested in purchasing them and getting an autographed copy, and we'll do that after the presentation. The book describes her experiences during the years 1942 to 1946, when she was a teenage fugitive running from the Nazis. And I'm going to assist her in some of the readings because the contents bring up some very difficult emotions. Is the mic okay? Do I have it oriented on it? Okay. And you'll see that she does get emotional, and I hope you'll forgive her for that. So Annie, or Hannah Steindl Halberstam, was the eldest daughter of the Hasidic Rabbi Evranov Navtoplu in Slovakia. His name was Rabbi Cheska Straga Halberstam. Her mother, Chaya Rubin, was the daughter of a rabbi of a small town in Poland called Novi Vishnitz, where we recently visited. Her grandfather, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Halberstam, was known as the Stropkover Rebbe. He was a prominent regional Hasidic leader in Slovakia. And the same with her great-grandfather. And so I'm bringing these up because these characters will appear in some of the readings. The great-grandfather lived in the border town of Košice, which is both a Hungarian and a Slovak town, and it's right on the border, and you'll hear about some border crossings, so I just want you to know where those are. And this whole Hasidic dynasty comes from a guy who was known as the Sanzer Rebbe, Rabbi Chaim Halberstam, who sort of started this whole thing many generations ago. He was among the most revered rabbis of his time and was the chief rabbi of Poland. Mom had one sister and three brothers, and she is the sole member of her family to survive the Holocaust besides her grandfather. Upon coming to the U.S., she was married to my father, whose name is Israel Rubin, who became a sociology professor. And while she was raising her three children, she pursued studies in Russian history, and she has a PhD in Russian history from Kent State University. And she has also published a prior book called Shalom Aleichem, the writer as social historian, which describes how the works of Shalom Aleichem tell us about the conditions in the Russian Pale of Settlement that led to the rise of Zionism, socialism, and communism in that area. So she has also donated a copy of her memoir to the library here, and it's not a donation, it was actually a purchase by one of the congregation members, Roz. Thank you so much for that. And my point is just that that's here in the library for those of you who don't want to purchase a copy but would like to read the book. So my mom and dad lived for a few years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was born there in the neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, where, as you know, not too long ago, an anti-Semite killed many Jews just for being Jews, and you also know about the events in Poway and San Diego. And Mom feels the pain of those events more keenly, I think, than some, because of her memories of the Holocaust and her hope that these things will never happen again. She's now going to give you a little bit of context, and then we'll read 4 excerpts from her memoir, Just a Little Girl.
Thank you. Well, I don't come here as a historian or a scholar of the Holocaust. To me, it's not an area of study. It was the reality of my life. I'll be paraphrasing from my memoir, but first I'd like to give you a little bit of the context. I was 16 when my faithful journey began. I grew up in a loving home. I had a family, friends, teachers, relatives, everything a young girl needed in order to thrive. But one fateful day in March of 1942, all that changed. I suddenly lost everything. So how did such a thing come about? I lived, as you may have heard, in a country called Czechoslovakia, the first Czechoslovak republic. That democratic state no longer exists. It ended in 1938 when Nazi Germany invaded the republic and occupied the Czech part. The Slovak state, led by fascists, joined the Nazi powers and accepted all their evil legislation against the Jews. By 1942, the Jews of Slovakia had been stripped of their property, their livelihood, and their dignity. And between March and December of that year, 95% of them were deported from their homeland and brought to the labor and extermination camps of Poland. Excuse me. The first to be exiled were thousands of young boys and girls aged 16 and older who were taken to that area. The Slovak youth actually built the camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek. They were told that if they wanted shelter, they would have to build it. They were simply deposited into a field where there was nothing there. And they said, if you need shelter, you have to build it. And so they were the ones who were forced to build the camps. My parents, realizing that I would be among the thousands of these boys and girls, and rightly anxious about where these youth were being taken, sent me away from home, from Vrano. I went to my cousins in Bardejov, a different community in Slovakia, where I wasn't registered. No one knew of my existence there. My departure from home was traumatic. I had to leave all my dear ones, not knowing where or if I would ever see them again. I spent a few weeks in that other town, Bardejov, after which I decided to return home, come what may. But my journey took me through Stropkov, another community in Slovakia where my grandparents lived, and my grandfather was the rabbi. I got stuck there because all of my relatives thought it was too dangerous for me to go home, where I was being looked for. My parents and siblings were deported from Vranov to Poland while I was away. When my grandparents' town was also deported, my grandparents and I ran together from Slovakia to Hungary, where we lived in Budapest for a while. Although Hungary joined the Axis powers, it had not yet begun to follow Nazist degrees at that time. When the Germans came to Hungary in March of 1944, however, and began to deport its Jews, we ran back to Slovakia and hid separately. My grandfather and I were reunited and rescued to Switzerland in April of 1945. My grandmother didn't make it. She was caught, deported to Auschwitz and killed there. Eventually, in December of 1946, my grandfather and I came to Ellis Island and we were admitted to the United States. The first section of my memoir that I will write is called Preserved, One Document Missing.
Imagine a girl in her early teens walking to the house of a school official with a peculiar request.
The girl goes with reluctance. She's distraught and anxious, but when she reaches the house, she summons her courage.
She rings the bell and asks for an audience with the man she must see. After a lengthy wait, the school director opens the door and she confronts him with her request.
I want a favor from you, she whispers in a barely audible voice. A letter, a copy of the document that tells about my illness. Otherwise, I will be sent away to a labor camp with all other Jewish boys and girls. Please help me.
So that's who you are, the ex-student whose family perpetrated the swindle, who cheated the school by pretending that you were too ill to attend. What an outrage. Don't you people realize that we know the truth? You are not ill. You are no more ill than I am. Now you have the audacity to ask me to become a party to your lies.
Frightened by the ferocity of his onslaught, the girl breaks down and weeps. As the director talks, she remembers the different occasions her schoolmates had brought her into conflict with her pious parents who opposed her participation in many of the required school routines. She knows her parents meant well, but is unable to articulate her feelings. She just stands there weeping silently. The director interrupts her reverie.
I cannot help you. I cannot give you what you want. It would do you no good anyway. I know, believe me, I cannot help you. No one can.
She feels herself dismissed and turns away in sorrow. The ordeal is over and she's on her way home. She feels relieved at the sudden termination of the dreadful spell she had been under all morning, but a sense of relief is short-lived.
She hasn't forgotten the reality awaiting her at home. The urgency of her errand had pushed the terrifying dilemma to the back of her consciousness. Now the thought of it is coming to the fore, assailing her with all its force.
She can't recall most subsequent details of that fateful day. Only isolated items stand out clearly.
She remembers the sense of urgency that surrounded her final preparations.
Her broken, depressed mood, how she took leave of her father, who embraced her warmly and placed a hurried kiss on her lips. The rush to the bus stop accompanied by her mother, who helped carry her small valise.
She remembers.
The bus is late and there is a long wait in the street. She looks around her and takes in all of the familiar sights. The storefront behind the bus stop crowded with teenagers, the school building visible in the corner, the shops across the street, and some of the people who work there. Soon they will be closing up for the night to return to their homes.
How dreadful to have to leave behind so suddenly all that is familiar.
It isn't the first time she's leaving home, but this now is altogether different. Where is she going? What will she find when she gets there? How will she survive alone? And what will happen to them while she is gone? When will she return? When the time comes to board, her mother helps her up and finds her a window seat in the middle of the bus. She's trying to compose her, but the girl looks very sad when her mother suddenly stops in her tracks.
She forgot to bring the sandwiches she prepared for the journey. Will there be time to bring them before the bus leaves?
Mother hesitates. How can she let her go without food? She decides to take the chance and assures the girl of her immediate return.
Soon thereafter, the driver begins final preparations for departure.
The young girl sits in silence, anxiously awaiting her mother's return. She keeps looking out the window, craning her neck in the direction whence the mother is to appear, but she doesn't see her. No, mother is nowhere in sight.
At last, all seems ready. She hears the familiar roar of the engine as the driver begins moving the vehicle out into the road. He accelerates, increasing power gradually, and soon the bus is rolling along Main Street on the way out of town. The girl doesn't take her gaze off the window.
As they are passing the street leading in the direction of her home, she glimpses the figure of a woman turning the corner, running towards them. She holds a small parcel in her right hand and is waving frantically, trying to stop the bus.
But to no avail. The bus keeps moving on.
For a fleeting moment, the girl holds in view the image of the frantic woman as she desperately tries to stop the bus. Then, realizing the futility of it, gives up in resignation. It is the last time she sees her mother.
Town to town, house to house, her parents are deported while she is in transit. The second episode is called
Preserved, one note delivered.
One day, when all Jews are being herded together to be sent away,
in the community of her grandparents,
she climbs the fence into the yard of a neighbor and hides in their woodshed. She remains hidden there until late into the night.
She's hungry, cold, and depressed, having just witnessed the spectacle of all Jews of the town, young and old, hale or ill, walking toward the synagogue, hurried along by the police. She's terrified of the dark and exposure in the shed, but fears the people in the house even more. She considers knocking on their door and begging for shelter, but doesn't dare do so. Anxious and exhausted, she falls asleep.
She wakes to find a stout, youngish man with short, tawny hair and a red face looking her over. He says nothing, but his eyes speak for him. "Who are you?" they are saying. "What are you doing here in the middle of the night?"
She decides to tell all, how she climbed the fence, watched the entire community being driven from their homes, and stayed here in the shed since early morning, afraid to knock on their door. "No one knows I'm here," she whispers.
The fellow, without a word, motions to her to follow him. By the door to their house stands his mother, the widow. She is a middle-aged, haggard woman dressed in peasant garb. Hearing the story, she takes the girl by the hand and pulls her into the house.
She finds himself in a dingy room smelling of bacon and cabbage. The table near one of the walls is piled with empty dishes. The woman brings out a clean plate, places on it a slice of black bread with butter. She fills a glass with milk and offers it to the girl, whom she pushes into an empty chair.
While the girl eats, the widow calls in her son and tells him to make a bed for himself in the woodshed.
When the girl has finished eating, the widow makes up her son's bed and tells the girl to undress. She helps him into bed, dims the lamp, and exits. The girl is overwhelmed with gratitude. She begins to recite her prayers silently, but with great devotion, then turns to the wall and abruptly falls asleep.
The next day, it is almost noon by the time she gets up. Her head aches. She tries to eat some food the widow places before her, but finds that she cannot swallow a single bite. She pushes aside the plate, rises slowly, and approaches the widow who is busy at the stove.
I need a favor from you. I must send a message to my grandfather, to my grandparents. Do you think your son might go and take it to them? They should be informed that I am here.
I'm afraid my son can't do it. He is at work, but I will go. Give me the message.
She hands the girl paper and pencil and stands by silently watching her write. The girl scribbles a few lines on the paper, looks through it, and hands it to the woman.
The widow departs and makes her way to the house of the rabbi.
She's taken aback at the sight of the old people. They are both pale and look haggard. The rabbi has a bandage over his right eye, covering part of his forehead and the right side of his head.
The widow hesitates, then approaches. Does it hurt very much?
Not as much as having to see all our children depart,
Says the rabbi's wife.
They knocked him down, you see. He was running after the children. He pleaded with them to let the children stay, but it did no good. They took a club to him and left him lying unconscious. I was relieved to find him alive.
I hope this will cheer you up. She hands them the note she brought. The rabbi approaches, unfolds the note with a puzzled expression, and reads in a hushed voice.
My dear grandparents, I slipped away yesterday. The widow and her son took me in. I think it's safe for them to know. I want to join you. No one knows I'm here. I'm waiting to hear from you. I love you. Your granddaughter, Shanda.
Eventually, the widow returns, and when it's sufficiently dark, with her son on the lookout, she delivers the girl, like her note, to her grandparents. The third episode is called
Preserve One Prayer Book Not Printed on Paper.
The young girl, after months of evading the authorities, finds herself trying,
with the assistance of Avram,
to once again cross the border.
illegally.
Once again, deportation in Slovakia is in full swing.
They slowly make their way into a dense forest. There are no clear paths and no signs to mark their progress. It is only the beginning of fall, and the day was warm, but the night now is cold, and it is beginning to rain. The raindrops come scantily at first, and the two of them are shielded by the thickness of the forest. Soon, however, the drops change to a downpour, then to a torrent. The water rushes at them from every side in a steady stream until they are drenched to the bone. The boy approaches a tree and removes his pack.
We aren't going to make much progress while it's raining so hard. It's Erev Sukkot, the eve of Sukkot. I have been saying the prayers, all I could remember. I have no prayer book. I will say the Amidah now.
Good. The girl follows him into the shelter of the tree.
She stands with her head against the trunk and watches her companion in silence.
Avram stands with his face turned up, his eyes closed, his hands in his girdle circling his waist. He sways back and forth and chants the prayer silently. The girl admires his presence of mind and his devotion. She forgot, didn't remember even what day it is. At home, under normal circumstances, he would be in the synagogue. She, being female, would not be required to be at the evening service. She would recite her prayers at her festively decked out home and with other females all beautifully dressed for the occasion, would await the return of the man. How well she remembers the delights of that holiday, the building and decorating of the sukkah, accomplished amidst much bustle and joy. But now, what circumstances are these? How is it possible? The two of them alone, lost here in this forest, in the middle of this dreadful night, without anyone to care. As she observes Avram, she too wants to pray, but she doesn't know the prayer by heart, no prayer book. She closes her eyes filled with tears and murmurs silently, "Dear God, on this holy day, please help us. Help us find our way and lead us to safety."
She then sits on the ground, her back against the tree, her head on her knees, and sobs silently and long. Her tears bring relief. She slowly raises her head, dries her eyes, and stands up. Her companion finishes his prayer.
They resume their journey through the dark.
Time passes. The final episode is called
Preserved, one document forged for freedom.
The young girl is now in the employ of a Gentile family who don't know that she is Jewish.
She closes the heavy door behind her and steps out into the street. The bakery is not far away, and as she turns the corner, she can see the bread line already long, growing longer. She's hungry and cold. The weather had changed suddenly with an abrupt fall in temperature. The prospect of waiting in line for who knows how long frightens her for another reason as well.
It is a bad business to be thus exposed.
Yes, she has the documents, her official identity, but is it wise to stand around in lines as she must now do? But how can she avoid it? Running errands is part of her job.
To refuse to do so under some pretext would be to call undue attention to herself at a time when they may already be suspecting her.
She looks around furtively and fingers the ID in her pocket. It is there, but how good is it? That last stamp, a good imitation, the fellow who brought it had told her, but will it work? She raises the collar of her coat to shut out the wind, but also to shut out the malevolent forces that threaten her. This may be the way Eritka was called. Poor Eritka didn't show up at the meeting for the last 2 months.
The two of them had been meeting with 3 others.
Young fellows posing as Aryans who worked around the city. Each knows little about what the others are doing, where they live, or who they really are. They know each other by code name only. Hers is Bethka, her friend's Eritka. But Eritka didn't show up. Only rumors that she had been caught persist.
She is jolted out of her reverie by sudden tension and much chaotic movement and noise. The line is being cut off on all sides by a contingent of SS men in full regalia, their glossy black boots flashing, their clubs and guns swinging. They surround the people standing in line and demand documents. The girl is pushed forward by those behind her.
Her heart sinks, then begins to race. Her knees tremble so violently that it requires all of her strength to remain standing, to prevent falling face down in front of everyone. This is it, she thinks, the end of the road for me, the dreaded test, the thing I so desperately feared and worked so hard to avoid. It's here after all.
One of them is approaching her now and is asking to see her papers.
Is this an evil dream, or does it nearly seem so to me? She sees herself reaching into her pocket, pulling out her ID card and handing it to the SS man facing her. Surely he must have noticed my shaking hand. He takes the card from her and examines it for what seems like an eternity. She expects that any second now there will be his heavy hand on her shoulder, pulling her out of the line. to accost her with the dehumanizing treatment reserved for victims like her, for Jews.
She watches him extend his arm and braces herself to fend off the attack.
But the hand at the end of the arm holds her ID card, which she returns without a word and moves on.
She takes the card and puts it mechanically into her pocket.
She pulls her garment tightly around her to steady herself, to conceal her trembling, which she is unable to conceal, and begins walking slowly toward her building. Gradually her fear diminishes, her step becomes light, she experiences elation and joy. Her heart, her senses sing a silent prayer. Years later, recalling the incident, she knows it was the ode of praise to the God who rules over life and death, the God who preserves. So this was my journey. My daughter Chaya will now say a few words about the legacy of the Holocaust. After that, we will be happy to answer some questions you may have.
The first piece of the legacy of the Holocaust that I wanted to mention is the obvious consequence of the Holocaust for those who survived and their children, as you can imagine, is grief, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. The excerpts my mother has read you surely underline why. However, my parents endowed us, the 3 children and many grandchildren and great-grandchildren at this point, with a very different legacy that I'd like to share with you today. They viewed anti-Semitism not through a Jewish lens, but rather through a universal one. So the first piece is how much they emphasized avoiding demonizing other groups of people. So when I was growing up in our integrated neighborhood in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, some of our Jewish neighbors referred to our black neighbors as Schwarzes. Although descriptive, it just meant blacks in Yiddish, I knew it was an insult, a way of referring to that group of people that implied that they weren't good. It was always used when describing bad things. Schwarzes could not be trusted. They weren't smart. They didn't value education. They stole. They beat people up in the street. They mugged people. They committed murder and rape. In our house, however, my parents did not allow the word Schwarzes. When my brother as a teen came home from school using disparaging epithets about various ethnic groups, my father chastised him very sharply. He said that calling individual people by a negative group name was bad, and that this was how the Holocaust happened. In our house, there weren't Dagos, Wops, Pikes, Niggers, or Schwarzes, or Red Riders. As a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, I learned that this was its most important legacy, and that I must continue to spread this message. Do not demonize others based on their membership in a group, based on race, ethnic identity, or any other group characteristic. Evaluate each person on his or her own merits. Do not let negative group traits, valid as they may be in general, blind you to the fact that individuals differ, and that within most cultures, good things accompany the bad, and individuals defy stereotypes. The second part of the legacy is about asylum and sanctuary. I learned from my parents how blessed they were to make a home in the United States after miraculously surviving the Nazi murder machine which tried to kill them for 4 years and which killed all their nuclear family members. I learned how tragic it was that the U.S. did not admit the 6 million Jews before they died, many of whom applied for U.S. visas and were turned down. The entire world denied the European Jews entry. Even most American Jews ignored their plight. Powerful Americans like Breckinridge Lawn and Roosevelt State Department joined Hitler in characterizing Jews as spies and communists and succeeded in keeping them out. Roosevelt did nothing to help them either, despite repeated pleas from Grover McDonald, the head of an international refugee commission who later became the first U.S. ambassador to Israel. So 6 million people died. Today, people say Syrians are terrorists and we shouldn't let them in. Some Jews are afraid because they're anti-Jewish. Another legacy of the Holocaust is just, as I said before, not to generalize about people as a group. Find out who people are, test their loyalty, but don't generalize about who should immigrate here based on their country of origin or their ethnicity or their race. Be inclined to admit people whom other people are demonizing or seeking to kill in their home countries for racial or ethnic or religious reasons when they seek asylum. Good people who embrace the best ideals of the United States are found in every racial and ethnic group. The Holocaust teaches us that this is our true enemy, demonizing others. When you hear someone advocating violence against an entire group, whether it's with poison gas in vans in concentration camps like the Nazis did, assault rifles in schools, suicide bombings, or using innocent civilians and children as shields for military operations, as is done by Hamas, or you hear them advocate excluding whole groups of people from our country on the basis of race, country of origin, that idea is our enemy. I hope that all of you will speak up against these ideas when you hear them. As Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Don't think that someone else will do it. If you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. My parents imparted these ideas to me and their other children with great vigor, and I can think of no greater tribute to them than to share these universalist ideals and values with you today. And now I'd like to give my mom a chance to just remember her family, which she likes to do at the end of these talks. I also just wanted to let you know that we do have, for those of you who came in before I said it, there are books, her memoirs, in the back of the room, which will be happy to autograph a copy of one that you purchased today. Thank you so much for your attention, and Mom, I'm going to give it back to you.
So I should like to take this opportunity to tell you a bit about my family, who were the real victims of the Holocaust. I haven't spoken much about them, I haven't grieved for them, I have no graves to go to, no such designated place to do such grieving. The world doesn't know about their existence. They are a cipher, a number among the 6 million, but they did exist as flesh and blood, with all the ambitions, aspirations, and hopes, characteristics of human beings, and with limited capacity of humans to endure pain and suffering. They were young. My parents barely 40, in their prime. My siblings, before they had a chance to begin their lives. Their suffering, what can one say about that? The incredible humiliation, the torture, cold, hunger, thirst, illness, the knowledge of inevitable death. All those brutalities their captors are known to have inflicted upon their victims. They lost their lives on Kiddush Hashem, literally the sanctification of the name of the Lord. They were murdered for the sole crimes of being Jews. I will not mention their names. I think we should all be standing when I read their names. My father, Rabbi Yecheskel Schreiber Halberstadt. My mother, Charlotta Chaya Soro Halberstadt. My sister, Tzipora Clara Halberstadt. My brothers, Chaim Shmuel and David Halberstadt. Excuse me. May their pure souls ascend before the throne of God, and may they be instrumental in bringing our lasting peace. Thank you very much for grieving me at this moment. Please be seated.
If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them, or I will.
I'll ask, dear. After so many years of these memories, when did you begin work on the memoir?
My work on the memoir.
When did you begin working on the memoir to bringing back all these memories?
I would sit down when as I was going through my routines every day, being a young mother, doing my work. I was also a professional, I was a teacher. So when I had a chance, I would sit down and write a few lines every day. And before I knew it, it became a book. You know, there was a lot to write about.
She had really finished it by the year 2000, but never published it. And you'll see if you obtain it that many, she wrote that she had sort of changed a lot of names, and I think she felt that, you know, that there were some difficult things in the book, and that there were some people who were alive in it that she mentioned, and she wasn't sure they would want their names bandied about in a book, so
I changed names and localities sometimes. My daughter tells me in retrospect that it was a mistake to do that it would have been better, more authentic, had I just written the true names of the people.
Well, there's an appendix that sort of says where the places actually were, so you sort of know that. But I think that caused some psychological delay in publishing the book, you know, just worrying about that, feeling, well, gee, if it was me, I wouldn't want somebody else writing about me without my permission, and most of these people aren't with us anymore. You know, so you can't get their permission.
Tell me about meeting your husband.
My husband is not alive. My husband was...
When you met him.
When you met him.
I met him, we were both refugees, and we actually met in school. Also, we were really actually introduced by a friend of ours. We happened to be going to the same school, Washington Irving Evening High. It was for refugees after World War II who came to New York, and they needed to work during the daytime and study at night. So we were able to learn English in a hurry. We were able to go to school after work. And my grandfather was a rabbi. My grandfather and I were fortunate to come to the United States together, and he was still young enough to establish a congregation of his own. And a friend of my husband was one of the congregants, and he actually introduced me to my husband. So I knew this friend of my husband's because he came to pray in the congregation of my grandfather. And I met him there. And he introduced his friend to me, who later became my husband. Did I answer that question?
Thank you.
Yes.
It was very impressive, your contribution, and so was yours. And it's not the first time I hear stories like that, because I'm from Czechoslovakia, as I told you as well, and so I've known all my life what has happened. I still keep wondering, you know, it's how does one whose family perished, and never mind if it was 70 years ago, 50 years ago, yesterday, how does one get along in everyday life, you know, because it's like people who don't have much knowledge about the psychological effects might say, well, it happened in the past, you know,
we now live in a safe environment, so-called safe, right? It's never safe.
Right.
But definitely safer than what you went through and those 7 million of people. But still, you know, the history is in us. It's not 70 years ago, it's now, it's every day. And one can see it because, you know, you get emotional and so it's the day. And so my question is, how have you coped all those years with it? How, maybe if it is too personal, don't answer it, you know.
No,
but,
it's a very legitimate question. The thing is, I had to think of my own safety. And this was, you know, they were taken away and the danger still hovered over me. And I had to, every day, to make sure that I am safe, that I am not caught. So I sort of, the need to take care of myself helped me get through it, you know. And life is the life force in us has certain things that it demands. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we have to try to care for us, no matter how depressed we are and how alone we are. If we want to remain alive, we have to take care of ourselves. So that, in a sense, makes it possible for you to survive. Being busy trying to take care of yourself. Of course, the memories were very destructive, and it was very terrible. But in those days, I didn't know what really happened to them. I kept hoping that they will return, that they will come back. Most of us didn't know the worst until after people who returned from the camps told us what went on, after we found out. I was hoping that one day I'll be reunited with my parents, and I was trying to save myself so that my parents, I have to give credit to my parents for sending me away from home at a crucial moment when 16-year-olds and older were taken away and sent to the concentration camps. And my mother grabbed me one day and said, "You got it out of bed," and said, "You gotta leave home right this minute." And I got dressed in a hurry, and she took me to the bus, and I went out of the city so that when they came looking for me, I wasn't there. I have my parents, my mother primarily, my mother and father to thank for the fact that I'm alive.
I think you might have also been asking about sort of later on in life, how do you cope having this memory? And I'm sure my mom could say more about that, but just from observation, you know, I think it was very difficult for them. Both my parents were the only survivors of their nuclear families. And so I didn't have any aunts, uncles, grandparents, first cousins, you know, none of that. And, you know, and of course I met people here in the United States who did, you know, and I saw the difference between having a big extended family to rely on, or any extended family, and not having that to rely on. My parents, you know, when they were young parents, they didn't really know much about raising children. You know, my brother used to say he was the guinea pig because, you know, they didn't know anything about it. And, you know, you may be laughing, but he wasn't saying it in jest. You know, he was very traumatized by some of the things my parents did, that as young parents, they just really didn't know any better, and they had nobody to ask. And like, what do you do when a child is naughty? And, you know, as my brother kind of was, and drops crystal bowls out windows and puts sugar in people's gas tanks. And, you know, they really didn't know what to do, you know, and how to keep him, you know, sane and themselves sane. And they made a lot of mistakes. You know, they made a lot of mistakes in how to discipline him, and they caused him a lot of pain. And I think these are things that wouldn't have happened if they'd had their, you know, if they had siblings, if they had, you know, somebody to give them some respite, somebody to say, hey, listen, you know, kids do this, you know, let's take them out for a walk and let's bring them home, you know, it's not the end of the world. So I think some of that was missing in the household, and, you know, and it was hard for them to cope, being, you know, new refugees, new immigrants, learning the language, getting an advanced education, you know, and putting so much energy into things and then raising the family as well. And it sure would have been nice had they
I
had.
had grandparents, you know,
Yeah.
to help out. We didn't have
So that might have been, you know, a little bit related to what you were asking. I hope it was.
And I also wonder how the following generations, like your generation, who had never experienced it, yet you did. You did through your parents, and you know, it's psychically, it's passed on.
Well, the most marvelous thing about them, and you know, they're very special people, and I'm sure you could tell that from meeting my mother, but they really did emphasize this message of, you know, how this happened was by being negative. So like, for example, some people wouldn't buy German goods after the war at all, and they just said, you know, Germans are terrible. And my father said, Germans are not terrible. You know, what happened is, you know, this was a cultural brainwashing. You know, they, for 10, 20 years, it was drummed into them that Jews are vermin, Jews are insects, you know, they're not human beings, you know, and to treat them like human beings, and, you know, we need to get rid of them, they're the enemy of our country, we need to get, you know, they're doing everything that's bad. And you hear this over and over, and you hear it in school, and you hear it from the government, and you hear it from the church, and, you know, it just goes on. And eventually you sort of become numb to it. You're like, oh, okay, I guess that's right. These people are horrible, and, you know, and my father didn't want to think that Germans couldn't be better than that. And, you know, he taught us to expect the best of everyone and to not generalize about people, because, you know, he was a sociologist, and he said, you know, these things come in waves, and any culture could experience this. It could happen here, it could happen, you know, to you, it could happen to a different racial group, and, you know, you just need to do the best yourself and not be a victim of that same
Well,
mindset.
actually, as a sociologist, he also knew that that Germany, for instance, had different roots that prompted that kind of thing. In the United States, such a thing would not happen because of our political roots, which were entirely different. You know.
I don't think, that wasn't what he told me, but he may have said that to you. So I think that, you know, but I think his general point was he didn't boycott Germany, and in fact, he was pleased that the Germans did so much to educate the next generation about the Holocaust. And I remember in college, one of my roommates had a German boyfriend, and I told my dad, this friend of mine who's Jewish, she has a German boyfriend, and I thought he would be sort of upset or, whatever, he knew her. And he said, well, this generation of Germans is different, they've grown up differently, and I told him that, the person had asked me, what do Jews celebrate instead of Christmas, and instead of Hanukkah, I said D-Day. I was just sort of like poking, and my father said I shouldn't have said that, that wasn't not a nice thing to do. That was, he sort of tried to turn it around for me, like how would I feel if somebody, said something like that, sort of thinking, Jews are Christ killers or whatever, and they, and I had asked a question like that, and then they had turned that around, again with this sort of unfair group characterization. So he was very sensitive to that and making sure that his experiences didn't get repeated in the next generation. That what I learned from it wasn't Germans are bad, but rather that, generalizing about groups of people and killing other human beings is bad.
Yes.
I just want to thank you for being willing. This is obviously both your mission and passion, and yet tremendously personally challenging and hard to relive these words and these memories. It's so well written, so well explained. It totally put me in the place of the story of your past experiences. And I want to thank you for being willing to share this with us. you know, and relive it again and again. You know, it's obviously out of your wish to help more of us, and hopefully we will share too, you know, and society learn from this, which I don't know if we'll ever stop needing to deal with these demons, you know, because of the things that we know are going on in the world right now, but we can continue to hope, and we have to keep these ideas alive, so
Thank you
so
for
much.
your comment.
Yes.
That's really, you know, a remarkable thing, and I just wanted to add that it's so wonderful to know about the people who did, you know, one of the lessons of the memoir is just the inspiration you feel when you see that there were, you know, 2-3% of people who just went above and beyond. I was talking to this young woman in the row, the first row here, who told me that her parents in the Czech Republic hid a Jew, or more than one, in their house during World War II. And, you know, just, it's so inspiring. My mother wouldn't be here if there weren't, you know, 20 or 30 people who had done that along the way. And it is one of the messages that regardless of how bleak times are and how desperate and how awful, there are kind and compassionate people, and not only kind and compassionate, but courageous, because these people, her parents, you know, they were risking their own lives. And as I was telling her, the Jews didn't have a choice. The Germans were targeting them and were committing a genocide. They had no choice. They had to be under this threat. Her parents didn't have to be under this threat. You know, they could have just said, you know, better not take any risks. We'll just, you know, stay under the radar here. But they didn't do that. They had the courage to hide people, the courage to do what was right. And, you know, just to know that there are people like that. And I hope in this room there are many people like that who
I
do that.
literally would not have survived without people like that who helped me. You know. All through my struggle, there were people on the right and on the left who came to my rescue, without whom I would definitely not have survived.
And then the other thing is, I'm sure you can see that my mom credits divine providence with most of these, you know, it's impossible to imagine how many decisions she had to make, and that each one of them turned out to be the right decisions. Really very miraculous thing, and I think that's preserved her faith, you know, both in God and in humanity. Is there a time for more questions? Because there are a couple more people raising their hands, but I know we're running late.
So having the opportunity to go back to the Czech Republic and revisit the society in which you grew up with, how have those lessons been extolled in this generation, in the 21st century, that you've seen within your homeland?
Wonderful to me. I mean, all of my idealism and all of my, and whatever enlightenment toward people there is in me came from that period of the First Czechoslovak Democratic Republic under the auspices of President Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and Eduard Beneš, and people like them who educated us. I was fortunate enough to go to primary school when I was in at least the first 5, 6 grades, when it was still a democratic republic, before the Slovaks split up and created their own fascist state. But during that period, the schools were wonderful in inculcating humane ideals into us, you know, democracy, humanity, you know, idealism toward people, and all that you find in a working democracy.
I was asking about the Czech Republic today.
Oh, about the Czech Republic to know.
Yeah.
And
I
how that
don't know
relates
much
to-
about it because I came away before the Czech Republic was created. I was not in Czechoslovakia at that time, and I really,
You've been in Prague since, you know.
yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful, I don't know really many details about it, but I know that it is supposed to be a democratic republic now, right? The Czech Republic.
It's complicated.
There was a lot of, for a while, the Czechs and the Slovaks were occupied by communists.
And that's what makes it so complicated.
And that's what makes it a bit complicated, because the culture became entangled with that also. It became influenced a little bit by that. I don't know. The legacy left by the first Czechoslovak Republic was certainly wonderful.
Yes.
And I wish that the idealism and the humanism of that republic would somehow survive.
The Slovak state, on the other hand, which is really where my mother was born, so they had different roots. And they, you know, they became a fascist state during the war. They collaborated actively with the Nazis. As my mom said, they implemented everything against the Jews. And in Slovakia today, I think it's recovering, but it's suffered a lot from that. And its legacy was definitely not as, you know, in terms of anti-Semitism, there's persistent anti-Semitism there, you know, as recently as, I remember in 2002, the cemetery in Varnov was desecrated. Like, come on, guys, there hasn't been a Jew there for, you know, 60 years, you know, you could, like, let up already. You know? But they were still preaching anti-Semitism.
I will tell you something about the Jews.
Yes?
I know that there's a program through the Holocaust Museum for survivors to give presentations like this. And I wondered if you've been connected with that, and if it has connected you with other survivors, and what that might have meant for you.
Well, I don't think Mom has done anything through the Holocaust Museum. There are two projects that she has worked with. One is Yeshiva University has a high school for boys, and every year they do a film with interviews of 5 or 6 survivors. It's called the Names Not Numbers Project. And so if you go onto their website, they have a number of films, and there's one that Mom is in with 5 other survivors. In addition, more recently, there's a project called Project Witness, and in one of the phases of Mom's survival, she was in an underground bunker with 16 or 17 other people. And the Project Witness people interviewed people about one of the other survivors of that bunker, whose name was Rabbi Weissmandl. He was a very active and scholarly and famous rabbi, even here in the United States after the war. And there's a movie about his life, and she was interviewed for that as well. And actually, as part of that, she met the 2 grandchildren of the Austrian man who was not Jewish, who fed them in the bunker, who stole food for them and brought food to them every day in the bunker. And his 2 grandchildren attended the opening of that film. So that was really, again, a very inspiring thing to meet those people. Are there other video things that you've participated in?
I believe that I participated in, there was an attempt made, but unfortunately I was out of town, they weren't able to get me. But I was contacted by Spielberg, right?
Sure.
They wanted to have me interviewed, but they weren't able to reach me. I was in Israel at the time. And I never did make contact with them after I returned, so I missed out on that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening.